3 people lost their jobs, 1 executive almost resigned, and the company spent nearly $200,000 cleaning up a mess that started with an email I sent at 11:47 p.m. I didn't think it was dramatic at the time. I was sitting at my kitchen island in sweatpants, laptop open, half a glass of warm white wine next to me, replaying the afternoon meeting in my head like a bad podcast I couldn't turn off. I'd been with Stratadine Solutions for 6 years, worked my way up to senior operations manager, pulled 60-hour weeks during product launches, answered Slack messages at 6:15 in the morning, and still somehow ended up in a conference room being told by Melissa Grant, our director, that my team lacked strategic alignment. That phrase stuck in my throat like dry toast because what she really meant was that we disagreed with her new cost-cutting plan, the one that looked clean on a PowerPoint slide but would stretch our staff thinner than cheap printer paper. I remember the room being too cold, the fluorescent lights humming, Kevin Parker staring at the table like it personally offended him, and me nodding while something inside me tightened. By the time I got home that night, I told myself I just needed to clarify a few numbers, set the record straight. Nothing emotional, nothing reckless. So I opened Outlook and drafted what I thought was a professional, data-driven response outlining why cutting 2 analysts before Q4 would delay deliverables by at least 3 weeks and potentially cost us mid-6 figures in penalties. I even double-checked my tone, swapped out words like reckless for premature, changed "this will fail" to "this may create avoidable risk." It felt responsible. It felt mature. It felt like leadership. What I didn't fully process was the recipient list sitting right above the subject line. I meant to send it to Melissa and maybe copy Kevin. Instead, I hit reply all on a thread that included 27 people across operations, finance, and, because the universe has a sense of humor, the VP of strategy. I closed my laptop feeling oddly satisfied, like I'd finally said the quiet part out loud in a controlled, professional way. I slept fine. That was the most peaceful 8 hours I would have for months. At 6:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. By the time I rolled over, I had 38 unread notifications and 3 missed calls from Kevin. The first message I opened wasn't even from Melissa. It was from someone in finance I barely knew. Wow. Bold move. That's when my stomach dropped. Not because I thought I'd said anything untrue, but because I realized truth and timing are 2 very different currencies in corporate America. Within an hour, the email had been forwarded beyond our department. By 9:15, people I hadn't spoken to in years were stopping by my desk just to check in. Some whispered that I'd finally said what everyone was thinking. Others avoided eye contact like I was contagious. And Melissa? She said nothing. No reply. No Slack. No calendar invite. Just silence, which somehow felt louder than any all-caps response she could have sent. I kept telling myself this would blow over, that professionals debate ideas all the time, that we were all adults making 6-figure salaries in a glass building off the interstate. But as the day unfolded, I could feel something shifting, like a hairline crack running through the foundation of the office. Teams that used to grab lunch together split into smaller groups. Meetings got rescheduled without explanation. And every time someone's phone buzzed, they glanced at me before checking it. That was the moment I understood I hadn't just sent an email. I'd drawn a line down the middle of the company, and whether I meant to or not, everyone was about to pick a side. By 10:30 that morning, the office felt different, like the air pressure had shifted, and everyone was waiting for a storm that might or might not hit. I tried to act normal. I refilled my water bottle, answered routine messages, updated a project tracker, but every small task felt staged, like I was pretending to be the version of myself from 24 hours earlier. Kevin finally walked over to my desk instead of messaging me. He did not sit down. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets and said, very quietly, that Melissa had canceled her one-on-one meetings for the day. That was not normal. She guarded her calendar like it was classified information. When I asked if she had said anything about my email, he hesitated for a second too long and told me that the executive team had been pulled into a closed meeting at 9. No agenda shared. No notes posted. Just a block on the calendar labeled internal alignment. I nodded like I understood what that meant. But what I heard was that my late-night attempt at professional clarity had reached a level of the company where conversations happened without documentation. Around lunchtime, I noticed small social shifts that would have seemed harmless on any other day. Two analysts who usually grabbed sandwiches with my team walked out with someone from Melissa's department instead. A Slack channel that had been active all morning suddenly went silent when I posted a routine question about timelines. Even the receptionist gave me a polite but distant smile, as if she had been briefed on something I had not. I kept replaying my email in my head, line by line, searching for a sentence that crossed from assertive into insubordinate. I had not insulted anyone. I had not questioned authority in a personal way. I had presented data, cited projections, and asked whether we should reconsider the timing of staffing cuts. In business school, that is called healthy debate. In real life, I was beginning to understand that debate depends heavily on who initiates it. At 1:15 in the afternoon, I received a calendar invite from Human Resources for the following morning at 8 o'clock sharp. The subject line read discussion regarding communication protocols. No details. 30 minutes blocked. Required attendees: myself, Ashley Monroe from Human Resources, and Melissa Grant. My chest tightened, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I recognized the choreography. This was no longer about spreadsheets or deliverables. It was about hierarchy. Kevin sent me a message seconds after the invite came through asking if I was okay. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on a simple yes. The truth was more complicated. I felt a strange mix of defiance and doubt. Part of me believed that if leadership truly valued transparency, they would appreciate someone raising a concern before it turned into a quarterly failure. Another part of me understood that public correction, even when polite, can feel like public embarrassment. By 3 in the afternoon, rumors were moving faster than official communication. Someone from finance told Jason Reed that the executive team was reviewing departmental structures. Another colleague said the vice president of strategy had asked for a full breakdown of operational costs going back 18 months. My name was not mentioned directly, but I could feel it hovering in the background of every whispered update. When I packed up to leave at 5:30, I noticed Melissa still in her office with the lights on, door closed, blinds half drawn. For a brief second, I considered knocking and asking to talk like adults. Instead, I walked past, badge in hand, aware that whatever happened next would not be decided in a hallway conversation. It would be decided in rooms where tone matters more than numbers, and where a single email can redefine how leadership views your place in the company. That night, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of being fired, but because I knew the meeting at 8 o'clock was not about facts, it was about framing. I arrived at the office at 7:30, earlier than usual, the parking lot still half empty and the sky a dull gray over the interstate. I rehearsed what I would say while sitting in my car, reminding myself to stay calm, to focus on data, to avoid sounding defensive. By 7:55, I was outside the small conference room near Human Resources, the one with frosted glass walls and a table barely large enough for 4 people. Ashley Monroe was already inside arranging a legal pad and 2 pens as if we were about to negotiate a contract. Melissa walked in at exactly 8 o'clock, not early, not late, wearing a navy blazer and an expression that was carefully neutral. She greeted me by name, polite but distant, and took the seat across from me. Ashley began by thanking us for coming and stating that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss professional communication standards and organizational alignment. The language sounded rehearsed, which meant the conversation had been planned before I ever opened my laptop 2 nights ago. Melissa spoke first. She said that while she appreciated passion and initiative, she was concerned that my email had created confusion across departments and undermined strategic cohesion. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse me directly of insubordination. She simply framed my message as destabilizing. I responded by explaining that my intention had been to flag operational risks before they turned into measurable losses. I referenced projected delays in Q4, potential penalty clauses in our vendor agreements, and the cost of rehiring if we cut analysts prematurely. I kept my tone steady, but I could feel the tension in my shoulders. Ashley asked whether I had considered raising those concerns privately instead of in a group thread. That question lingered longer than any accusation would have. The honest answer was that I had considered it, and I had chosen not to, because prior private concerns had been acknowledged and then quietly ignored. Instead of saying that, I replied that the thread already included cross-functional stakeholders, and I believed transparency would help align everyone on the data. Melissa leaned back slightly, and said transparency is valuable, but timing and structure matter. She added that executive decisions require trust, and public disagreement can erode that trust. The word trust felt heavier than any spreadsheet I had ever built. The meeting lasted exactly 30 minutes. Ashley summarized that we would all recommit to respectful and structured communication moving forward. There was no formal warning, no disciplinary notice, but there was an unspoken understanding that I had stepped outside an invisible boundary. As we stood to leave, Melissa paused and said she hoped we could move past this productively. The phrasing sounded generous, but it carried a condition. When I returned to my desk, Kevin swiveled in his chair and looked at me with silent questions. I gave him a small nod to signal that I was still employed. For the next few hours, nothing dramatic happened on the surface. Emails were answered, meetings were held, deadlines were discussed. But by mid-afternoon, I learned from Jason that Melissa had scheduled one-on-one sessions with several team leads, excluding me. Finance had requested updated cost models, and the vice president of strategy had asked for a comparative analysis of departmental efficiency. My email was no longer the topic of open conversation, yet its impact was quietly shaping agendas behind closed doors. I began to realize that this was not a single confrontation that would resolve in a conference room. It was the beginning of a longer shift in alliances, perceptions, and influence. The company had not exploded into chaos. It had done something more subtle. It had started recalibrating around the idea that I might not be fully aligned, and in a corporate environment, that perception can move faster than any official announcement. By the following week, the shift inside the office was no longer subtle. It was organized. Meetings that I used to lead were now being co-hosted by Melissa or reassigned entirely. Agendas were rewritten to emphasize efficiency metrics instead of long-term risk. I noticed that when I spoke in cross-functional calls, people listened carefully but responded cautiously, as if every agreement might be interpreted as alignment with me rather than with leadership. The tone of the building had changed from casual collaboration to careful positioning. Kevin started closing his office door more often. He still spoke to me, still asked for updates, but there was a measured quality to his questions, like he was documenting answers in his head. Jason, on the other hand, was more open. He stopped by my desk one afternoon and said that several managers privately agreed with my analysis, but felt the way it surfaced forced them into a corner. That was when I understood the deeper problem. It was not the numbers. It was the visibility. When disagreement becomes public, neutrality becomes risky. 2 days later, an email from Melissa announced the formation of a strategic efficiency task group to reassess departmental performance before the next quarter. The group included finance, strategy, and 2 senior managers from operations. My name was not on the list. Kevin's was. Jason's was not. The message framed the task group as a proactive measure to ensure sustainable growth in a competitive market. It sounded polished, forward-thinking, responsible. It also signaled that the conversation I had tried to start was now being controlled at a higher level without me in the room. Around the same time, performance dashboards were circulated more widely than usual. Metrics that had once been internal were now shared across departments, highlighting minor delays and cost variances in bold formatting. None of it was catastrophic. No single figure justified panic. But the pattern was clear. The narrative was shifting from whether the staffing cuts were wise to whether operations had been performing strongly enough to question them in the first place. In one meeting, Melissa presented a slide comparing projected savings against historical overtime expenses. She did not mention my email. She did not need to. The implication was that stronger cost discipline would solve more problems than additional headcount. I countered with updated delivery timelines and client feedback indicating that responsiveness mattered more than marginal savings. The discussion remained professional, but I could sense invisible lines forming in the room. Afterward, Kevin pulled me aside and suggested that I focus on reinforcing team morale rather than challenging strategy in open forums. He said it gently, almost apologetically, but the advice carried weight. It meant that my role was being redefined. Instead of strategic contributor, I was being nudged toward operational executor. That same afternoon, Ashley from Human Resources requested updated documentation of team workflows and individual responsibilities. She framed it as routine alignment ahead of year-end reviews. Yet the timing felt precise. The company was mapping influence, accountability, and potential vulnerabilities. I began to realize that what started as a disagreement about staffing was evolving into something broader, a quiet contest over credibility. Melissa was consolidating support through structured initiatives and executive visibility. I was relying on logic and informal alliances. In corporate environments, structure often outpaces logic. By Friday, rumors circulated that organizational adjustments might be announced before the next earnings call. No one confirmed specifics, but the possibility hung over every conversation. As I packed up that evening, Jason asked me if I would send the same message again, knowing what it triggered. I paused longer than I expected. At that moment, I was no longer thinking about spreadsheets or projections. I was thinking about perception, power, and the realization that influence is rarely determined by who is right, but by who controls the room when decisions are made. The official announcement came on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:30, packaged as a company-wide town hall with less than 24 hours notice. That alone told me it was significant. Our chief operating officer opened the meeting with polished optimism about adapting to market conditions and strengthening long-term resilience. Melissa presented next, walking through slides that outlined a refined operational structure designed to streamline decision-making and increase accountability. The language was calm, almost reassuring, but every bullet point felt like a quiet rearrangement of power. Operations would now report through a newly created performance oversight channel that fed directly into strategy. Team leads would have expanded reporting responsibilities. Cross-departmental approvals would be centralized. My title remained the same on paper, Senior Operations Manager, but the scope beneath it shifted. 2 analysts who previously reported directly to me would now split time supporting the strategic efficiency task group. Kevin's role expanded. Jason's responsibilities narrowed. No one used the word reorganization, yet that was exactly what it was. After the town hall ended, Slack lit up again, but this time the tone was cautious and analytical rather than emotional. People were trying to decode what the structural changes meant for their own security. Within an hour, I received a calendar invite for a follow-up discussion with Melissa and Kevin. When I walked into the conference room, the mood was businesslike, not confrontational. Melissa explained that in order to demonstrate unified leadership, we needed consistent messaging across all levels of operations. She said the recent public disagreement had exposed misalignment that competitors could exploit if internal uncertainty slowed execution. I listened carefully. The phrasing was strategic. She was not blaming me directly. She was reframing the narrative as collective vulnerability. Kevin outlined new reporting expectations, including weekly performance summaries and tighter approval cycles for budget adjustments. The implication was clear. Oversight was increasing. Autonomy was decreasing. I agreed to the structure without protest, aware that resistance would only reinforce the perception that I struggled with alignment. Over the next several days, the impact became tangible. Jason was reassigned to a cross-functional analytics support role, officially to broaden his exposure. Unofficially, it removed one of my most vocal allies from daily operations. 2 junior coordinators approached me privately asking whether their positions were secure. I gave them honest answers based on the information I had, which was limited. For the first time in years, I felt like I was managing uncertainty instead of strategy. Meanwhile, Melissa's visibility within the executive team increased. She was frequently seen walking into closed-door meetings with the vice president of strategy. Her updates were circulated company-wide, emphasizing measurable savings projections and disciplined execution. The storyline had shifted from risk mitigation to efficiency leadership. By Friday, I received my mid-cycle performance check-in summary. It acknowledged my analytical strengths and commitment to operational excellence. It also noted an opportunity to demonstrate stronger executive presence through structured communication channels. The phrase was carefully chosen. It meant that future disagreement would need to be channeled privately and strategically. As I sat at my desk reading that summary, I realized the conflict was no longer about whether staffing cuts were wise. It had evolved into a referendum on leadership style. The organization had stabilized on the surface, but underneath, alliances had been clarified and influence redistributed. The cost of that late-night message was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in reporting lines, meeting invitations, and subtle shifts in who controlled the narrative about our future. 3 weeks after the town hall, the numbers everyone had been debating finally started to move in a direction no slide deck could spin. Delivery timelines slipped by an average of 12 business days across 2 major accounts, and overtime hours climbed higher than they had been in the previous quarter despite the staffing reductions. None of it was catastrophic, but it was measurable, and in corporate environments, measurable trends carry more weight than opinions. I updated the dashboards exactly as requested, sending the weekly performance summaries every Monday at 8:30 in the morning, attaching detailed breakdowns with no commentary beyond factual notes. I had learned my lesson about tone. Yet inside the office, tension returned in a different form. Instead of open disagreement, there was quiet strain. Analysts were juggling expanded reporting requirements while trying to meet client expectations. Kevin looked more tired than usual, spending late evenings reviewing consolidated metrics for the Strategic Efficiency Task Group. Jason, now split between departments, stopped by less often, but when he did, he admitted that the additional oversight layers were slowing decisions instead of accelerating them. What changed the atmosphere completely was an email from one of our largest clients requesting clarification on delayed milestones and hinting at potential penalty clauses if timelines were not recovered within 30 days. That message did not originate from me. It came from outside, from a paying partner whose concerns could not be reframed as internal misalignment. The executive team called an emergency strategy session. This time, I was invited. The conference room was full, including the vice president of strategy and the chief operating officer. Melissa presented first, outlining market headwinds and transitional friction following the structural changes. When she finished, the chief operating officer asked for operational insight on capacity constraints. For a brief moment, the room turned toward me. I spoke carefully, walking through the correlation between analyst reductions and increased overtime, referencing exact percentages and projected recovery timelines if temporary support were reinstated. I did not mention my earlier warnings. I did not need to. The data aligned on its own. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a longer than usual silence as executives processed the implications. By the end of the meeting, a temporary contractor budget was approved to stabilize delivery through the end of the quarter. It was not a full reversal of the staffing cuts, but it was an acknowledgement that capacity had been stretched too thin. Afterward, Kevin pulled me aside and admitted that the client escalation had shifted internal perception. The conversation was no longer about whether I had overstepped communication norms. It was about preventing financial impact. Even so, the damage to internal trust did not instantly disappear. Melissa maintained her composure and publicly supported the contractor decision as a strategic adjustment. Privately, our interactions remained formal and measured. I could sense that while the data validated my concerns, the method by which I raised them months earlier still lingered in memory. Within the team, morale improved slightly once temporary support was announced, but people were more cautious than before. They had seen how quickly influence could shift and how easily narratives could be reframed. As for me, I found myself reflecting on the difference between being right and being effective. The organization was adapting, but the culture had changed. Conversations were more calculated. Messages were shorter. Meetings had clearer hierarchies. What began as a single moment of public disagreement had evolved into a company-wide lesson about power, perception, and the cost of challenging strategy without controlling the stage on which that challenge plays out. The approval for temporary contractors stabilized our deadlines, but it also exposed something that could not be patched with budget adjustments. The executive team began asking a different question, not only whether the staffing cuts had been premature, but how internal disagreement had escalated to the point where it shaped structural decisions. A week after the contractor approval, I received a direct request from the Chief Operating Officer for a written assessment of operational risks over the next 6 months. It was the first time since the conflict began that someone at that level had approached me without filtering through Melissa. I understood immediately that this was not just about projections. It was about trust. I spent 2 full days drafting the assessment, documenting capacity thresholds, workflow bottlenecks, and the measurable impact of reporting layer expansions. I wrote it with precision and restraint, avoiding emotional language and focusing entirely on operational data. Before sending it, I paused longer than I had with any previous message. This time, I selected recipients intentionally and confirmed each name twice. The response came within hours. The chief operating officer thanked me for the clarity and scheduled a follow-up discussion, including Melissa and Kevin. When we gathered in the larger executive conference room, the tone was notably different from earlier meetings. There was less defensiveness and more analysis. The discussion centered on balancing efficiency initiatives with execution stability. Melissa acknowledged that transitional friction had been higher than anticipated. She did not frame it as a mistake, but as an aggressive timeline that required recalibration. I contributed insights without referencing past warnings. The focus was forward-looking. By the end of that session, the Strategic Efficiency Task Group was redefined with clearer operational checkpoints and shared accountability between strategy and operations. Kevin's expanded role remained, but my involvement in cross-departmental planning increased again. The shift was subtle, yet meaningful. Influence was redistributing once more, this time through structured dialogue rather than public tension. However, not everyone benefited equally from the recalibration. Jason's temporary reassignment became permanent, officially described as an opportunity for cross-functional growth. In reality, it removed him from the daily operations core. 2 junior coordinators accepted positions at other firms within a month, citing uncertainty about long-term direction. The company did not collapse, and no dramatic announcement reversed every earlier decision. Instead, the organization evolved into a more cautious version of itself. Meetings were meticulously documented. Sensitive concerns were raised in smaller circles. Public threads became carefully curated summaries rather than spontaneous debates. One afternoon, Kevin admitted that the entire episode had forced leadership to reconsider how dissent should surface. He said that while the method had been disruptive, the substance had not been wrong. That acknowledgement mattered, even if it arrived quietly. As for Melissa, our working relationship settled into professional equilibrium. We collaborated on revised capacity models and presented a unified front in executive reviews. There was no apology exchanged between us, and none was requested. The understanding was implicit. In corporate environments, lessons are rarely declared. They are absorbed through process changes and altered behavior. Looking back at the past 2 months, I realized the organization had weathered more than a policy dispute. It had confronted the tension between authority and expertise, between control and transparency. The contractors eventually rolled off as timelines normalized and quarterly results met revised expectations. On paper, the company moved forward. But inside the culture, something permanent had shifted. Everyone had learned how quickly a single decision could ripple outward, reshaping alliances, redefining credibility, and forcing leaders to reconsider how power is exercised when challenged in full view of the entire organization. By the end of the quarter, the crisis that had once felt immediate turned into a case study people referenced without naming directly. Delivery timelines stabilized, client penalties were avoided, and the executive team highlighted operational resilience during the earnings call. On paper, it looked like disciplined leadership and agile correction. Internally, however, the memory of how close we came to larger consequences lingered in subtle ways. I noticed that before any major proposal moved forward, there was now a preliminary alignment session behind closed doors. Draft presentations were circulated to a smaller circle before being shared widely. Slack threads that once hosted spontaneous debate became carefully moderated summaries. It was as if the organization had installed an invisible filter between thought and distribution. My own role evolved again, not through title changes, but through proximity. I was included earlier in planning discussions, asked for risk assessments before cost models were finalized. The chief operating officer began inviting me to monthly operational reviews that previously included only directors and above. Melissa and I developed a rhythm that was efficient, almost strategic in its restraint. We scheduled regular one-on-one meetings focused strictly on forward planning. There were no references to past tension, yet both of us understood the importance of controlled communication. Kevin adapted as well, balancing his expanded oversight with a more diplomatic tone when bridging departments. The organization functioned more smoothly, but it also felt more cautious, as if everyone had recalibrated their instincts about when and how to challenge a decision. Outside observers might have described the period as growth through adversity. Inside the walls of the building, it felt more like institutional memory forming in real time. Jason eventually accepted a permanent position within strategy, leveraging the exposure he gained during the task group phase. We met for coffee a few weeks before his official transfer, and he admitted that the turbulence had accelerated his career path in unexpected ways. He also said that without the earlier conflict, leadership might not have scrutinized operational assumptions as deeply. That observation stayed with me. Not every consequence had been negative. Some were simply unpredictable. As for the junior coordinators who left, their departures forced us to rethink talent retention and communication transparency. Human Resources launched a survey on psychological safety and feedback channels, an initiative that might never have surfaced without visible tension. Even Melissa acknowledged during one executive review that structured dissent, when managed carefully, can strengthen strategy. It was not framed as a concession, but as evolution. Months after that late-night decision that set everything in motion, I found myself reflecting on how easily confidence can blur into confrontation when filtered through digital communication. An email feels controlled while you type it, but once released, it travels without tone, without context, without the protective nuance of conversation. The organization survived. Careers shifted. Reporting lines adapted. No one walked away unchanged. What surprised me most was not that disagreement created friction. It was that the friction revealed underlying vulnerabilities that had existed long before anyone pressed send. In the end, the company did not fracture into permanent factions. It recalibrated. Authority became more deliberate. Expertise became more structured. And I learned that influence in a corporate environment is not only about being correct. It is about understanding the stage, the audience, and the ripple effect of every word distributed across a network that never forgets.